Today, we are covering 6 major developments shaping the geopolitical landscape as of April 10, 2026. Putin announces an orthodox Easter ceasefire after previously rejecting Ukraine's proposal. Iran demands Lebanon ceasefire and asset unfreezing before peace talks with the U.S. can proceed. Netanyahu announces negotiations with Lebanon following White House pressure. Vice President J.D. Vance travels to Pakistan for the highest-level U.S.-Iran talks in decades. Zelensky's chief of staff expresses cautious optimism about negotiations with Russia. And Europe quietly increases Russian gas imports as Middle East supply collapses. Let's get into it. Vladimir Putin announced on April 9th a unilateral ceasefire along all front lines in Ukraine, set to begin at 4 p.m. on April 11th and last through the end of April 12th, coinciding with Orthodox Easter Sunday. The timing is impossible to ignore. For weeks, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had been publicly calling for exactly this kind of humanitarian pause during the Easter holiday, a proposal that Moscow dismissed and ignored while continuing to rain missiles on Ukrainian cities. And now, with the entire world watching, the Kremlin has essentially adopted that same proposal as its own, framing it as a gesture of goodwill rather than a response to pressure. The statement from the Kremlin called on Ukraine to follow Russia's example, and Zelensky responded by saying Ukraine had already stated its readiness for reciprocal measures. Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha went further, suggesting that a lasting ceasefire could open the door to genuine diplomacy and, potentially, the end of the war. But here is the brutal irony of this moment. Russia spent the entire week leading up to this announcement continuing to attack Ukrainian cities, even as Kiev was proposing the very ceasefire Moscow is now claiming as its own initiative. Whether this 48-hour pause represents a genuine shift in posture or a calculated public relations move ahead of international negotiations remains to be seen. What is certain is that both sides say they will hold fire, and for millions of people in Ukraine, that is not a geopolitical abstraction. It is the difference between life and death for 2 days. Now shift your attention to the Persian Gulf, because what is happening there right now is one of the most consequential diplomatic flashpoints of the decade. On April 10th, Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf announced on social media that 2 conditions must be met before peace negotiations with the United States can formally begin: the unfreezing of Iranian assets blocked by American sanctions, and the establishment of a ceasefire in Lebanon. Kalibaf claimed both measures had already been agreed upon with Washington, a claim the U.S. has not confirmed. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi echoed the demand, specifically calling for an end to Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon. This came just hours before Vice President J.D. Vance was set to board Air Force Two, bound for Islamabad, Pakistan, where the highest-level U.S.-Iran diplomatic talks in more than 40 years are scheduled to take place. President Trump, for his part, responded on Truth Social with characteristic bluntness, writing that the only reason Iran still exists today is to negotiate, and warning Tehran not to play games with the American delegation. The backdrop to all of this is the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply normally flows. Iran effectively closed the strait after U.S. and Israeli strikes on February 28th, and the consequences have been catastrophic. Before the war, 140 ships passed through on a typical day. Now Iranian vessels move freely while others remain blocked. Iran has floated the idea of charging transit fees, reportedly up to $2 million per vessel, payable only in cryptocurrency or Chinese yuan. The European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, and multiple other nations have condemned this plan. U.S. inflation data released on April 10th showed consumer prices rising 0.9% in March alone, the fastest rate since the shock of mid-2022. And economists say the energy disruption will continue to ripple through the global economy for months even if negotiations succeed. If you want to follow these developments as they unfold and get the kind of deep analysis that mainstream news rarely offers, consider subscribing to this channel and activating notifications. This is the kind of story that changes by the hour, and we cover every layer. In a development directly connected to the Iran crisis, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced on April 10th that he had instructed his government to begin direct negotiations with Lebanon as soon as possible. The announcement followed phone calls on April 9th with President Trump and White House envoy Steve Witkoff, who reportedly urged Netanyahu to scale back attacks in Lebanon and pursue a diplomatic track. This is a significant shift. Just days earlier, Netanyahu had given the green light to intensify operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and within 24 hours of the U.S.-Iran ceasefire announcement on Tuesday, Israel launched what Lebanese authorities described as the largest single assault of the war, killing more than 300 people in densely populated areas. On April 10th, alone, Israeli strikes killed more than a dozen people across multiple towns in southern Lebanon, including 13 Lebanese security forces killed in an attack on a government building in Nabatea. The Lebanese government and France have been pushing for direct Israel-Lebanon peace talks for weeks, with Paris even drafting a proposal that would require Lebanon to take the unprecedented step of formally recognizing Israel. Israel initially rejected that framework. But with the White House now explicitly warning that the Lebanese front is threatening to collapse the broader ceasefire with Iran, Netanyahu changed course. A first meeting between Israeli and Lebanese representatives is expected next week at the State Department in Washington. Israel's ambassador, Yechiel Leiter, and Lebanon's ambassador, Nada Hamadeh Moawad, will lead their respective delegations. Crucially, however, an Israeli official told Axios that there will be no ceasefire in Lebanon during these negotiations. The bombs will keep falling while diplomats talk. J.D. Vance departed Washington on April 10th, heading to Islamabad for what could fairly be described as the most consequential American diplomatic mission since the end of the Cold War. Alongside him are Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner. The Iranian delegation is led by Foreign Minister Araghchi and Kalibaf. Pakistan declared 2 days of public holidays in its capital for security reasons, emptied the Serena Hotel in the heavily fortified Red Zone, and deployed more than 10,000 security personnel. The parties are not expected to meet face-to-face. Instead, Pakistani officials will serve as intermediaries, shuttling between delegations in what diplomats call proximity talks. The date of the formal start remains unclear, with Pakistan saying April 10th and the White House indicating April 11th. Vance told reporters before departure that he expected positive negotiations, but made clear the American team would not be played. Trump, meanwhile, has been explicit about the stakes, warning that U.S. warships are loaded with the best munitions and ready to resume strikes if talks collapse. The agenda for Washington is straightforward: reopen the Strait of Hormuz, dismantle or freeze Iran's nuclear program, and reduce Iranian proxy activity across the region. Tehran's agenda is equally clear and far more expansive: lift all sanctions, receive compensation for war damages, and gain formal recognition of Iranian authority over the strait. The gap between these positions is enormous, and yet both sides are in the room, which is itself a fact that would have seemed impossible 6 weeks ago. On the Russia-Ukraine front, Kirilo Budanov, chief of staff to President Zelensky and a member of Ukraine's negotiating team, expressed measured optimism on April 10th, saying he does not expect the peace process to drag on for long. Budanov noted that both sides have staked out maximalist positions, but argued that all parties understand the war must end. He pointed to Russia's financial hemorrhaging as a key incentive for Moscow, noting that Russia has already spent amounts in the trillions in its own currency sustaining the war. Sources close to the Kremlin, however, offered a far more sobering assessment, saying the talks have produced little real progress and remain deadlocked over security guarantees for Ukraine. These sources suggest any final agreement would need to involve not just Moscow and Kiev, but Washington and European capitals as well. Budanov also confirmed that American envoys Witkoff and Kushner may visit Kiev next week in what would be their first trip to Ukraine since the war began, though no date has been confirmed by the White House. And then there is the quiet story that explains a great deal about European politics right now. In the first quarter of 2026, European Union countries increased imports of Russian liquefied natural gas by 17% compared to the same period in 2025, purchasing 5 million tons worth approximately 2.88 billion euros. The reason is straightforward. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz has cut off a major alternative supply route from the Middle East, and European buyers have turned back to Russian LNG from the Siberian Yamal project to fill the gap. 97% of Yamal's cargo in the first quarter went to Europe, with 25 shipments arriving in March alone, immediately after the strait closed. The European Commission has said it will offer gas producers greater flexibility on import rules to prevent shortages. All of this is happening while the EU officially maintains its goal of eliminating Russian gas entirely by the end of 2027. The contradiction is stark, and it illustrates something important. The energy weapon cuts in multiple directions, and the country that controls the supply often has more leverage than the one that controls the policy. What you are watching today is not a collection of isolated crises. It is a single interlocking system under pressure from multiple points simultaneously. A ceasefire in Ukraine that may or may not hold. Peace talks between the U.S. and Iran that may or may not begin. Israeli strikes in Lebanon that are threatening to unravel the broader truce. European democracies quietly buying Russian gas while publicly condemning the Kremlin. And a global energy crisis that is showing up in real terms in American grocery stores and fuel prices. The world is at a hinge point. What happens in Islamabad over the next 48 hours, what Israel decides to do in Lebanon tonight, and whether Russia actually holds its Easter ceasefire, all of it matters and matters now. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the U.S.-Iran talks will produce a real agreement, or is this a temporary pause before the next escalation? We want to hear from you.